Hi, Club Advisors. My name is Chris Fiorello. I'm the Assistant Dean of Students here at Seattle University. I want to thank you so much for deciding to participate as a club advisor. Clubs and student organizations matter to students. They matter because they're great opportunities for leadership development and professional development, and they're an excellent co-curricular opportunity for students to really hone and develop the skills they're learning in the classroom. So your choice to be an advisor supports them in this way, and it is so vital to the experience, so thank you. This training is focused on alcohol and other drug policy at Seattle University. Specifically, we'll talk about if your club or organization that you advise wants to host an event with alcohol, what are the parameters for that? I'm going to start this conversation by talking about substance use at Seattle University. In particular, I'm going to focus on alcohol and cannabis use because that's our two most prevalent substances at Seattle University. The third most prevalent is tobacco or e-cigarette use. In fact, e-vape is more prevalent than general cigarettes on campus. Other drugs drop off from there, or other substances, I should say, drop off from there. Making it, for the purposes of this conversation, not necessarily something that we need to focus on when we're talking about university events and policy. However, I do want to talk a little bit about alcohol consumption. You can read the statistics on the screen, so I'm not going to focus on those. If you ever want to have a conversation about these, I'm happy to engage with it. But the key pieces I want to highlight are that our graduate students are more likely to have consumed in their lives and more likely to consume on a regular basis. That's not surprising given the age of many of our graduate students. What is important to recognize, though, is when we look at estimated BAC, and this all comes from the National College Health Assessment, we did this survey in 2026 in winter quarter. Our graduate students are also more likely to have consumed less the last time that they drank. And so when we look at this, they have a mean BAC of 0.03 and a mean BAC of 0.05 for our undergraduate students. What that means is that generally both undergraduate and graduate students are drinking at lower rates. However, based on those large standard deviations, we also recognize that there are a subset in the population of students who are consuming much more heavily, which is something we want to be mindful of as we look at potentially having alcohol at university events. With regard to cannabis, I bring this up because cannabis is legal in Washington state, but not permitted at any university events. But what we see is reflects what is in the community, which is that our graduate students are more likely to have used cannabis and more likely to have used cannabis in the last month or even within the last 2 weeks. When it comes to cannabis for both undergrad and grad students, we want to recognize that students who are using cannabis and have used it within the last month are actually more likely to be on the side that is within the last 2 weeks or within the last week. So using cannabis more regularly. The last two things I want to point out is that we want to also focus on the flip side of some of the statistics, particularly around alcohol. When it comes to saying 71% of our undergraduates have consumed alcohol at some point, that sounds like a lot, but when you flip it and you say, well, 29% of our undergraduate students or 12% of our graduate students have never used alcohol, we suddenly recognize that there's a large population of students to whom events that have alcohol probably do not appeal. And so we want to think about how it is that alcohol is fitting into our choices around events. The very last statistic is I want to also mention that 1.3% of our undergraduates and 5.4% of our graduate students identify as being in recovery from alcohol or cannabis use. So once again, thinking strategically, thinking thoughtfully about when we choose to have alcohol at events and who is excluded from those events. So let's talk university policies. The first thing to understand is that the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act applies to Seattle University, meaning that federal law applies. So while state law permits cannabis, cannabis cannot be permitted at any university function or event. For that reason, there's no cannabis possession or use regardless of age, and there's no being in the presence of cannabis regardless of age. When it comes to alcohol, we shouldn't be surprised that there's no possession or consumption by persons under 21, and persons under 21 cannot be in the presence of the consumption of alcohol. There is an exception for as it's permitted by university policy and state law, and that's really a carve-out for university events where there is alcohol present. The last thing to note about the policy is that public intoxication is never allowed regardless of age, and that doesn't mean having any quantity of alcohol. It really means that the person needs to be safe, in control of their body and their faculties, and able to engage and participate appropriately given the setting. And that's really what the public intoxication policy boils down to. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the club event policy. Seattle University allows registered student clubs and organizations to host events with alcohol present. However, all of this must be approved, and there must be discussion with Center for Student Involvement and university events. I say this so before we discuss any of the actual requirements, the second that a club says, I want to host an event with alcohol, go ahead and say, let's contact the Center for Student Involvement. And this is a bunch of professionals who do these kinds of things for a living, who host events, including events with alcohol for a living. And so they're going to figure out a way to make what the students are trying to have happen within university policy. The requirements are that at a minimum, the student organization complete an alcohol event request form with CSI, minimum of 4 weeks in advance. And again, because this form requires certain information on it, it's really good to start that planning and discussion well before that 4 weeks. A week before, an alcohol service request form needs to go to university events, and that's available on the university events website. In these documents, it's going to ask students for what is your rationale for serving alcohol? And what they're looking for is what the value add of it is. Why is this important to this particular educational experience? And CSI can really help students think through those things, as you should as well as their advisor. There will also need to be a detailed serving plan that talks about checking IDs, limiting the quantity of alcohol that an individual consumes. And then lastly, organizations need to make sure that they appropriately staff the event with public safety and Chartwells as servers. The next piece of it is around marketing. So the restrictions on this are that marketing cannot directly market the alcohol. That is because we don't want alcohol to be the focus of events. It's also part of, as you look at reducing alcohol consumption as part of the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act compliance, one of the things that they found is that direct marketing of alcohol encourages larger consumption. However, while you can't directly market the alcohol, we can say that ID may be required, and that is an indication that the event likely serves alcohol, or the location of the event may also indicate that. All events need to be approved, even off-campus events. And so while the minimum requirements are really focused about on-campus events, there are ways that CSI can work with student organizations to potentially host an event off-campus that involves alcohol in that event. The last policy that I'm going to talk about is our Red Hawks Care policy. We want to make sure that if students are concerned for the well-being of other students, that they go ahead and report those concerns to a university official, to a public safety official who can address those. In the policy, it says that students may be given amnesty from the integrity formation process for potential violations of the code of conduct, but they may be required to complete other educational activities. In order for a student to utilize this policy, they're expected to contact public safety, to remain with the individual about whom they have the concern, and cooperate with emergency personnel. They should also afterwards meet and cooperate with any integrity formation staff following the incident. The application of this policy is at the discretion of the Dean of Students or their designee. In my time at Seattle University, so long as students did what was expected, they contacted public safety, they cooperated, in all of those circumstances, the policy is applied. That said, there may be certain circumstances in which there was some other risk to community health that needs to be addressed through the traditional integrity formation process. But our real focus here is community safety and for students to get help for other students. Now that we've talked about policy, I want to actually talk to you about what your real role is as an advisor, because you're not expected to be the policy expert. Having a general understanding is great, but our Center for Student Involvement, our Office of the Dean of Students, are the policy experts. What you need to be is that thoughtful partner, talking to student organizations about their choices, their decisions, and whether those choices are going to really develop an educational experience for their organization that meets the goals of their organization. So, one thing that you can really ask is, what is the educational purpose or function of serving alcohol? We might have a learning to network event, and in particular, in certain environments, alcohol is very common in networking events. So teaching students how to consume appropriately and at low levels within events is an educational purpose that makes sense. At the same time, we also want to make sure that we're talking about who is excluded from the event. We already talked about students in recovery. We talked about non-drinkers at the university. And so we want to think about those and be mindful of how we're including people or excluding them from events. And then if a student organization is having frequent events where there's alcohol, is this limiting someone's access to the educational benefit of involvement in the student organization? And that is something that you as an advisor are in the appropriate place to have those conversations about what is the mission and function and purpose. It's not to say don't have an event with alcohol. It's to say be purposeful about the choice of having alcohol at an event and understand the implications. If a student organization does choose to have alcohol at an event, the student organization and the folks who are running the event are expected to report violations of the student code of conduct. When reporting, in the event of an emergency, 911 and public safety are the go-to people. If you don't have the public safety phone number in your phone, if your student leaders don't have that number in the phone, it's on the screen. Make sure that they have that number. And it's appropriate that after the fact, so after that immediate emergency is no longer there, they're also reporting to the non-emergency offices. And so the non-emergency offices and individuals are the Center for Student Involvement, the club advisor, which is you should know that something occurred, and the Office of the Dean of Students. And I say the Office of the Dean of Students because there may be follow-up with the Dean of Students office, but that will probably likely be initiated by the Center for Student Involvement when they receive information about something having happened at a student event. All right, very last thing. We want you to know that you're not alone in this conversation. Absolutely consult with the Center for Student Involvement. They are the experts at hosting events, at making sure that student educational experiences maximize benefit within the educational context and community. So their contact information is on the screen. Call them when there is consideration of hosting an event, and actually call them anytime that you have questions about a student organization and really how to fulfill that mission of the student organization. As well, the Office of the Dean of Students is available for consultation, particularly around policies and things that may be complex issues. We're constantly in communication with the Center for Student Involvement, so it's not like you need to make sure you contact both of us. If you contact CSI, they're going to be in contact with us to answer any technical policy questions and to discuss some of these issues. So that said, thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you so much for committing to being an advisor to a student organization. This is something that really matters in the educational experiences of students, and we so appreciate your willingness to do this.